This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nizzahon, and today I'm bringing you a special video, my Archetype guide for Ikoria, Lair of Behemoths. Over the last week I've done my set review, giving my thoughts about every single card in this set and how good or bad I think they will be in this new format. In this video I'm going to talk about what each of the color pairs in this format want to be doing, discussing the various synergies within each of those color pairs. This video is not one where I will talk about the best cards in the set or premium removal or things like that, unless some cards in those categories happen to have special synergy within a specific color pair. If you're interested in what cards I think are the best in this format, I would recommend watching my set review or my top 10 on the biggest bombs in the format, because in this video, we're just going to be talking about synergy, not power necessarily. Alright, let's get into our first color pair, which is black-green. So this format has 10 viable decks, 10 archetypes that are well supported by the format. 5 of those archetypes are really built around the big mechanical themes in this set, like the graveyard or humans or mutate, and then the other 5 are based on keyword abilities. And they don't have quite as much support as we'll see, but all 10 color pairs have some support. Alright, so black-green graveyard. The name is pretty obvious. It's a deck that wants to do things with the graveyard, want to get value out of the graveyard. So, as you can see, black-green has 3 signpost uncommons. That's what Wizards calls gold cards at uncommon that sort of push you in the direction of whatever the synergy is in that color pair, making it kind of obvious what the synergies are. In black-green, it's all graveyard stuff. You've got Back for More, which lets you reanimate a creature and have it fight something, Skull Prophet, which can mill cards from the top of your library into your graveyard, and Boneyard Lurker, which is a mutate creature and one that returns permanents from your graveyard to your hand. So, there are generally 2 things that graveyard decks need. They need reasons to put stuff in the graveyard, payoffs for doing it, and ways to fill the graveyard. Let's look first at how you can fill your graveyard in black and green, in commons and uncommons in this format. So you've got Corpse Churn, which lets you mill a few cards and also gives you some card selection. Dark Bargain, similarly, gives you some card selection, lets you throw a couple cards in the graveyard, counting Dark Bargain. Excavation Mole, which mills the top 3 cards of your library, in addition to being a really efficient trampler. Greater Sandworm. Okay, so Greater Sandworm doesn't inherently say, look, I'm going to be putting things in my graveyard and I have a payoff for it, but these big cycling creatures are going to be at their best in this deck because this deck has 2 reanimation spells at uncommon. And because of that, cycling away an early big guy and then reanimating him later in the game is very doable in this color pair. And that's why I have the Sandworm here. Same thing for Titanoth Rex. You know, you cycle it away early, you can reanimate it. Same thing with Void Beckoner. You can cycle it away early and then you can reanimate it. And there's also Skull Prophet, of course, that can help you mill your graveyard. So there aren't a lot of great ways to fill your graveyard in this set, as you can see, but there are ways to do it, and I think Excavation Mole especially is going to be a very key card for this deck. And even though there's really only 3 cards that are really good at milling you, other than Skull Prophet, they're all commons, so getting multiples of them isn't impossible. So what are the graveyard payoffs? Well, we've got Back for More, which is a reanimation spell. That's one of the ones I'm talking about that lets you reanimate something from your graveyard, and then it comes back, and it's a good creature to bring back really cheaply. But also it fights something. You can get crazy value out of Back for More. And of course Boneyard Lurker, which lets you return permanents from your graveyard to your hand. You also have Call of the Death Dweller, which lets you bring back 2 creatures from your graveyard with a combined converted mana cost of 3 or less, and they get some keyword abilities out of the deal. There's also Durable Coil Bug, who if it gets milled you can bring back later. There's Unbreakable Bond, which is the other uncommon reanimation spell that'll work really well with those cycling cards we were talking about. There's Survivor's Bond, which lets you reanimate a human and non-human from your graveyard. Well, not reanimate, but return them to your hand. There is Necropanther, who's, you know, it's a black-white card, but its mutate cost is hybrid, and it would be a good fit for this deck because it reanimates a small creature from your graveyard. So what are the rares that support this archetype? Well, there's Lurrus. I know it's technically black-white, but because it's hybrid mana, you can play it in this deck, and he lets you cast cheap permanents from your graveyard. Fiend Artisan gets bigger the more creatures you have in your graveyard, so that goes well here. Nethroi, Apex of Death. This is a bomb. It's going to be good in any deck, but you can do the mutate cost fairly easily in this deck because of the hybrid mana, and it's all about reanimating a bunch of stuff from your graveyard. Plus, playing 3 colors in this set, especially if one of your colors is green, isn't going to be that difficult, especially if you're just doing a splash. But you can probably even go pretty deep on 3 colors in this format without too much difficulty. I have another Apex here, Brokos, who, again, can mutate in this deck without any help. You need to be splashing blue to actually cast him, but he can mutate from your graveyard, so that's why he's here. There's Death's Oasis, another 3-color card. This one lets you mill stuff from your library really quickly. We saw that at common and uncommon, there's not a lot of really fast milling, but Death's Oasis can do it pretty quickly. In addition to returning creatures from your graveyard to your hand. There's also Titan's Nest, which I don't love, but it can turn the cards in your graveyard into mana, and you can mill 1 card from your library every turn. And so if you need to load up your graveyard, there are worse ways you could do it. Gyruda's another really good rare for milling. It mills 4 cards from your deck and 4 from your opponent, and then reanimates something with an even converted mana cost among those 8 cards. There's also Mythos of Brokos, which lets you get permanents back from your graveyard, and if you pay all of that Sultai mana, you also get to search your library for any card and put it into your graveyard. So that's black-green. As it often is, it's all about the graveyard. There may not be a ton of self-mill in this set at common and uncommon, but I do think the presence of cycling and reanimation spells is going to be a big feature in this deck, and it sure sounds like a lot of fun, if you're the one doing it anyway. Next, we'll look at another familiar mechanic, Blue-Red, which is all about spells, as it often is. There's a powerful instant in Channeled Force, which lets you rummage and do damage to things. That's nice. It's a way to fill your graveyard, actually. Not that that helps black-green a whole lot. Lord Dracus is a mutate creature who returns spells from your graveyard, and Sprite Dragon gets bigger every time you play a non-creature spell. So, let's look at the spell payoffs here. We have our friend Lord Dracus and Sprite Dragon. We've also got Spell Eater Wolverine, who gains double strike if you have 3 or more instants or sorceries in your graveyard. Pyroceratops, which gains a +1/+1 counter anytime you play a non-creature spell. Blitz of the Thunder Raptor, a removal spell that does damage equal to the number of instants or sorceries that are in your graveyard. Blister Spit Gremlin, which can do extra damage because you'll be paying 1 and tapping it and all of that, because it untaps every time you play a non-creature spell. So you have a bunch of common payoffs, and they're pretty good. I mean, the Gremlin, Wolverine, and Pyroceratops are all going to be really nice payoffs for this deck. Then you have the nice Signpost uncommons and the Blitz, which is a really powerful card in general. So I'm not going to go into detail about all the spells in this format because there's lots of them in blue and red. Suffice it to say, all the good removal spells and all the good spells in general are going to be good in this deck, extra good in it, because your deck is all about casting spells and getting bonuses out of it. There are some rares I want to talk about, though. For one thing, you have Lutri, the Spell Chaser. It's a companion, and it's the most doable one in the set, so having this as your 8th card at the beginning of the game is nice. And the real reason it's here isn't because of companion so much. It's because Lutri copies spells, your spells, when you cast it. So you can make extra copies of instants or sorceries that you cast, and that goes with this deck very well. There's also Riel the Everwise, a mythic rare who gets bigger, +1/+0 for every instant or sorcery in your graveyard. She's also good with cycling and discard effects because she'll draw you more cards along the way. There is Shark Typhoon, which if you don't cycle it, is a spell build around. It lets you make shark tokens equal to the converted mana cost of instants and sorceries, non-creature spells actually, that you control. The cycling option here is going to be more attractive in most decks. This is the one deck where you might consider actually just casting it. There's also Whirlwind of Thought, another 3-colored card. One, though, that, again, this format is good fixing. Going 3 colors will sometimes be easy, depending on the kind of fixing you get, and splashing is going to be really easy in this set. It's not going to be something that's hard to do, so splashing something like Whirlwind of Thought, which draws you a card every time you play a non-creature spell, isn't a crazy thing to do. You also have Narset of the Ancient Way. Her +1 and her -6 both care about you casting non-creature spells. Her -2, not so much, but it is good nevertheless. Vadrock, Apex of Thunder. This guy's a bomb in any deck, as all the Apexes are, but this one's going to be at its best in this deck because its Mutate trigger lets you cast a non-creature card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. And that's going to be the easiest to fulfill in this deck. So blue-red, all about spells. We've seen it before. We're seeing it again here. Now let's look at black-white, where the archetype is humans. Here, you've really only got 2 signpost uncommons, Dire Tactics, which is a great removal spell that's even better if you control a human, and General's Enforcer, who can make human tokens, and he also gives legendary humans indestructible. You may notice with General's Enforcer that it's kind of awkward that he doesn't actually do something for all of your humans, just your legendary ones, which are only in higher rarities, but that's okay. He's pretty efficient. He's a good card even without that, but it would be nice if he had a real human payoff, because he doesn't for the most part. So let's look at the human payoffs at common and uncommon in black and white. You've got Patagia Tiger, which is a nice flyer who makes a human bigger when it comes down until end of turn. Perimeter Sergeant, which gives all other humans +1/+0 whenever it attacks. Sanctuary Lockdown, which gives you a powerful human anthem that also lets you turn your humans into icy manipulators, tapping down a creature an opponent controls. I also include Fight as 1 here. It's a little weird. I mean, it's partly a human payoff. If you have humans, you can use part of the card. But ideally, you have humans and non-humans, like, say, a Patagia Tiger and a Perimeter Sergeant. That's when it will be amazing. So keep that in mind. Then, of course, there's Dire Tactics and General's Enforcer. So humans, in terms of the payoffs they got, I'm not ultra impressed with it. I think it's a little bit underwhelming. Sanctuary Lockdown is probably the best one, or maybe Dire Tactics, because it's good even in a non-human deck. But the fact that their General's Enforcer does what it does is pretty disappointing. I do think there is a sub-theme here where humans are also all about going wide. Perimeter Sergeant and Sanctuary Lockdown really showcase that. And there are several humans in this set who make creature tokens. Well, there's one in black at common and one at white at common. So I think this deck, while it has human things going on, it may just be more of a black-white aggro deck that plans on going wide. There is one rare to talk about here, General Kudro of Drannith, who is the human lord in the set, meaning he makes your humans bigger, and he also has some graveyard hate, and he can help you kill big creatures as well. So, that is it for black-white humans / go wide a little bit. It has a little bit of both going on. The support isn't amazing, which I think is a little disappointing, but we'll see how it pans out. Next, let's look at blue-green, which is really the color pair for this format's really crazy mechanic. It's new mechanic in this set, and that is Mutate. This color pair also just about having big creatures, and Mutate in some ways goes hand in hand with that, so they sort of overlap. So we have 3 signpost uncommons here. Trumpeting Gnar, which has Mutate, makes a 3/3 beast when it does mutate. Parcel Beast, which is a great card in general for drawing you cards, but it also has Mutate. And Primal Empathy, which is pretty sweet. Either it gives you a +1/+1 counter or an extra card every turn. If you have the biggest creature on the table, it turns into drawing a card. And obviously, Primal Empathy makes sure that eventually you're going to have the biggest creature because you keep getting those +1/+1 counters. All 3 of these are pretty nice signpost uncommons for this color pair. Don't get me wrong, by the way. Every color pair is going to have Mutate stuff going on. This is just where it's the most well supported. All right, first off, let's look at the commons and uncommons that have Mutate. There is Archipelagor, which is pretty sweet. It's a huge guy who taps stuff down. And the cool thing about Mutate is that it has synergy with itself. Most cards with Mutate have a Mutate trigger. And all of them say whenever this creature mutates. And that means if you mutate something on to one of these, say you hardcast Archipelagor, this means that later in the game, if you mutate anything onto it, you're going to get that trigger. And if you're mutating Archipelagor onto things, you're also going to get the trigger. And they can end up stacking. When you have, you're putting 2 creatures together who both have a mutate trigger, you're going to end up with 2 triggers, obviously, and it's going to be really good. And Archipelagor in particular really wants you to stack mutates on top of him because he taps down more things the more times he mutates. So that is one cool thing about Mutate. The cards with it are also the payoffs for it. For the most part, we'll see there's actually 2 other cards that are Mutate payoffs that don't have Mutate themselves, but most of them do. Like Archipelagor, Dreamtail Heron, which draws you a card when you mutate, Pouncing Shore Shark, which bounces something when it mutates, Migratory Greathorn, which searches your library for a basic land card when it mutates, Glowstone Recluse, which puts 2 +1/+1 counters on it and other things when they mutate. Auspicious Starix, which I think is one of the best uncommons in the set. It's like Archipelagor. It gets better the more times you mutate onto it, but its trigger is way crazier than Archipelagor's because it gets you free permanents into play. and that's pretty crazy. Trumpeting Gnar, we already saw, makes a 3/3 every time it mutates. And there's also Parcel Beast, which is the only card here that doesn't actually do anything when it mutates on its own, but it does have mutate, so it can trigger all of these. So these are the commons and uncommons that get you going with this mutate deck. There are, however, as I said, 2 other mutate payoffs. There's Polywog Symbiote, which makes your mutate creatures cost less, and if you cast a creature spell that has mutate, it lets you loot. And there's Essence Symbiote, which makes mutate creatures gain a +1/+1 counter and gains you 2 life every time they mutate. So one of the things you have to think about with all this mutate is what are the best things to mutate onto, right? Mutate involves casting things for an alternate cost, casting a card for its mutate cost, and then putting it either under or on top of a non-human already on the battlefield. Then, the ultimate result is a creature who has all the characteristics of the card on top, most notably power and toughness, but then it has the abilities, the text box of everything underneath it too. So the things you really want to be mutating on have nice text boxes that get even better when it's a larger creature. So that's what we're going to look at now. Common and uncommon creatures that are good to mutate onto. Things like Almighty Brushwag, who on his own, not very impressive, but if you mutate onto him, and he's usually going to be on the bottom because you don't want a 1/1, if you mutate onto him, he gives you trample and his pump ability, and gaining those on a much larger creature is pretty nice. There's also Glimmerbell, which you can mutate things onto to give them flying, and also use it to untap the creature. Something to note, by the way, mutate is kind of a mess, like with all of the crazy rules that are related to it, some of which are counterintuitive. One thing during my set review that I saw a lot of people saying is that, well, if you mutate something onto Glimmerbell, it's not going to be able to untap because it says untap Glimmerbell. And you would be right if that's literally, what it said, and it doesn't, though. Wizards says regarding this mechanic in the set notes, anything that has a creature's name in it, like the Brushwag 2, just turns into this creature once it's on a mutate. So you're going to still be able to use these abilities even though they have the names of the bottom cards. So yeah, Glimmerbell, you give flying and the ability to untap to a big creature. Phase Dolphin, it's on its own, attacking can be a little bit dangerous. It makes something unblockable. But if you mutate something larger on top of it, your opponent's going to have kind of a nightmare scenario where it's very difficult to kill what you're attacking with, and you have an unblockable creature every turn. Thieving Otter, which lets you draw a card anytime it deals damage to an opponent. Adding that to a more formidable creature, especially one with evasion, is pretty nice. Wingfold Terran is more expensive than these guys, which, you can play these guys early and then mutate things onto them pretty quickly. The Terran doesn't come until turn 6, generally, but it does have hexproof potentially. And one of the dangers of mutating is potentially, your stack of creatures getting blown up. If you play the Terran and choose hexproof, you don't have to worry about that very much. There's also Mosscoat Goriak. It just gives something vigilance, not the most exciting, but it does do something. Ivy Elemental is an interesting inclusion here. Normally, you pay 4 for a 3/3, and that's not so good. But if you mutate anything else on top of it, those counters will be added to that creature's power and toughness. Generally, when you mutate onto something, the only thing that matters for power and toughness is the creature on top. But because the counters are put on the creature separate from, the Ivy Elemental's written power and toughness, those counters stick around, and that's something to keep in mind. Exuberant Wolf Bear, it's already a big creature, but if you can mutate something bigger onto it to make humans a human attacker even larger, then that gets interesting. There's also Adaptive Shimmerer, which is very similar to Ivy Elemental in that it makes counters and they stick around. And there's also Mysterious Egg, which when it mutates, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. So that's all the mutating at common and uncommon, the cards with mutate, the cards that are the best to be mutating onto. I didn't name every single card in the set. You can mutate onto lots of things. These are just the things that I think bring the most value. In particular, that top row, which is, by the way, all commons. So that's a pretty nice thing to have going on. There are several rares for this archetype. You've got Gem Razor, another creature with mutate. His mutate trigger is kind of narrow, so it won't always come up, but he does have mutate. Sea Dasher Octopus, which is one of the cheaper mutates in the set. You can use it to flash it in on top of something. That means you can get, first of all, a mutate trigger at instant speed, and it also means you get to draw a card when it does damage. It's like the Otter, but better because it's increasingly more flexible. And then you also have 2 Apexes who, again, they're going to be good anywhere, but Mutate is what they do, and in this deck you're going to be able to make that Mutate trigger happen more frequently and more consistently than others. And actually, I guess Brokos's Mutate doesn't actually have a Mutate trigger, but if you're mutating it onto one of your other creatures who does, you still get the bonus, so it's still a little better here than it would be elsewhere. Next up, it's red-white, which has a cycling theme. You have 2 signpost uncommons there that really push you in that direction. Savai Thundermane, which lets you pay extra mana to do 2 damage to target creature and gain 2 life. And Zenith Flare, which deals X damage to any target and you gain X life, where X is the number of cards with cycling in your graveyard. So both of these are really powerful signpost uncommons. Zenith Flare on its own, if you end up in the right deck, it doing 7 or 8 to your opponent to close out the game, not that far-fetched. Similarly, the Thundermane is able to pick off creatures, gain you life, get some nice value out of cycling. So first, let's look at the other cycling payoffs. So we've got our Thundermane and Zenith Flare. There's also Rooting Moloch, who itself has cycling, so it's good with things like Zenith Flare and Savai Thundermane as well, but it lets you get a card with a cycling ability from your graveyard and exile it, and you can cast that card on the turn you play this or on the next turn. Reptilian Reflection becomes a 5/4 dinosaur, trample, and haste anytime you cycle. Prickly Marmoset gets +2/+0 anytime you cycle, which on a 2/3 first striker, not bad. Drannith Stinger does 1 to each opponent anytime you cycle, and it also has cycling itself. Drannith Healer gains you 1 life anytime you cycle, and it has cycling itself. Flourishing Fox gains you a +1/+1 counter anytime it's cycled, and also can cycle itself. And Valiant Rescuer, who has cycling and also makes a 1/1 token anytime you cycle something while it's in play. So there are some great payoffs here. And, you know, the 2 gold cards are great, but I think the Moloch, the Marmoset, and the Fox, and the Rescuer especially, are really good payoffs. And then you have all these other things. You know, the Marmoset for a common payoff is pretty nice. You have all these other things as well that are quite good. I'm not going to talk about every card with cycling in this set because there's tons of them. They're all over the place. Something to keep in mind is, if you end up with enough of these payoffs, it may become interesting to put cards with cycling in your deck that you actually can't cast. I think you'd have to really get there on cycling for that to be worth it. But if a card has cycling and you can't cast it, that might be okay in this deck. We'll just have to see. Some rares that go well here. Well, you've got Yidaro, which is basically the most fun cycling card in this set, I think. You know, he cycles and does the usual cycling thing, except he gets shuffled back into your library. When you cycle with him the 4th time in a game, he comes onto the battlefield for free. Also, if you get him back later, you can, you know, if you only cycle him once but then draw him and he costs 7, obviously you're going to play him if you have the mana. There's also Unpredictable Cyclone, which is a very complicated card, but basically it turns your cycling into super cycling, at which point anytime you cycle something, you get to make sure that you cast a card with the same card type from your library, and you get to do it for free. So instead of it being random in terms of maybe you hit a land with cycling, in this case it's random only in that you're going to be getting some random permanent of the same type as whatever it is you just cycled. But it seems like an amazing engine that's going to make cycling even better. Zerta the Dawnwaker is here because its ability to reduce the cost of activated abilities applies to cycling. So it can't reduce cycling below 1, but, you know, it would make Unpredictable Cyclone and Yidaro both cost only 1 to cycle, and that's real upside. So that's red-white. It's all about cycling, seems really well supported, as does Mutate. Really, I think, you know, of the 5 we've looked at so far, Humans is the only one I'm a little disappointed in. But those are the 5 archetypes that have the most support, and the ones that are really built around mechanical themes in this set. The remaining 5 are each built around a particular keyword. So let's look first at green-white, where Vigilance is what you want to be doing. You do only have 1 signpost uncommon in most of these color pairs we're looking at, these last 5 we're looking at. But you also have a signpost rare of sorts, a rare that is like a lord or of some kind, makes creatures with that keyword ability better. In this case, we have the Alert Heedbonder as our signpost uncommon, gains you life every turn for each card with Vigilance in play. And the Felidar makes it so all of your creatures with Vigilance can pay 1 and tap to tap creatures, which is really, really strong. So what are the Vigilance payoffs? Well, you don't have a ton of them compared to what we've seen before, but they are here. You know, you have your Heedbonder. Keensight Mentor gives something Vigilance, which is nice. If it's a non-human, it does. And it can also put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control with Vigilance, which is nice. If you're in this deck, it's going to be at its best. Solid Footing is also a Vigilance payoff. If you put this onto a creature with Vigilance, it starts to assign combat damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. And looking at the Mentor and Heedbonder, you can see that would be pretty good. I also have Swallow Whole here, not because it explicitly says anything about Vigilance, but because it'll be a little better there. The downside sometimes about casting Swallow Whole is that you have to tap down a creature you kind of wish you could also attack with, and you can actually do that here because of Vigilance. So those are the Vigilance payoffs. You know, they're not super plentiful, but they're there. Let's look now at creatures with Vigilance. You know, we've got our Heedbonder, Maned Serval, Majestic Oricorn, Imposing Vantasaur, Flycatcher Giraffid, which can have Vigilance if you choose that counter, Mosscoat Goriac, and Farfinder. So these are all cards with Vigilance that'll be at their best in this deck because this deck has extra payoffs for Vigilance. There's also a couple of rares here. One we've already seen in the Felidar. The other one we haven't, which is Kahira the Orphan Guard. It has Vigilance itself, and it will give all cats, elementals, nightmares, dinosaurs, and beasts Vigilance as well. And you're going to have those. Those are all creature types pretty common in this set, so it will be on the table with Vigilance itself and probably giving Vigilance to one other thing too. So, blue-black. Blue-black is all about flash. That's the keyword supported here. You have Cunning Nightbonder, which reduces the cost of flash spells and makes it so they can't be countered, and it has flash itself. And Slitherwisp, which is a super powerful payoff because every time you flash something into play, your opponent loses a life and you draw a card. So what are the flash payoffs? Well, it's even more sparse here. You have Cunning Nightbonder and Mutual Destruction, which becomes instant speed if you have a card with flash. So the payoffs here aren't as plentiful, but there's some more inherent sort of payoffs you get out of playing the flash deck, and that is that counter magic will be a little better than normal because you'll be able to leave mana up a lot if you're flashing things into play. So that is something to keep in mind. Other cards with flash at common and uncommon. Well, we have our Nightbonder, we've got Crustacean, Mystic Subdual, which is a nice removal spell anyway, Shore Shark, which we saw earlier, Blitz Leech, which is a card that looks like a lot of fun to me. Lots of 2-for-1s will be had. Also has flash. Lurking Deadeye obviously has flash. Adaptive Shimmerer does too. Capture Sphere does as well. So these are all the commons and uncommons with flash that if you get enough payoffs will become a little more valuable in this particular deck. Though as we saw, not like this deck is overflowing with synergies. There are some rares to talk about though. Dirgebat has flash. It's a great card anyway. Voracious Great Shark, same thing. Flash, great card anyway. Sea Dasher Octopus, we've seen as well, has flash though. Slitherwisp, we saw this earlier, but it's the most powerful flash build around in the set. So keep that in mind. Lutri, which has flash as well. So these are the cards with flash, one of which has a flash payoff itself in Slitherwisp. But yeah, overall, I don't feel like blue-black is the most supported of these 5 color pairs built around keyword abilities. But like I said, there is sort of the extra payoff of counter magic being extra good in your deck. Blue-white, it's flying. This is one we've actually seen a lot. You know, the other ones in this set aren't built around keywords that have received a lot of limited archetype support before, but blue-white has. This is, we call it blue-white skies even. So you've got Jubilant Skybonder, which makes your flyers harder to kill, makes your opponent pay more mana for them, and Skycat Sovereign as your rare, gets bigger for each flyer you have and makes flyers itself. The flying payoffs are the Skybonder, Wingspan Mentor, which lets you put a flying counter on one of your non-humans, and it can also make all your flyers bigger. Reconnaissance Mission doesn't actually say the word flying anywhere on it. However, it's going to be at its best here. You're going to have the most evasive creatures in this set, and you're going to be drawing cards off of the mission a lot more as a result. Gust of Wind becomes cheaper if you have a creature with flying in play, and reducing the cost of that spell to 2 is no joke. So, cards with flying. We have our Skybonder, our Glider, the Glider which can gain flying, Patasia Tiger, which we saw earlier. Spontaneous Flight puts a flying counter on something. Stormwild Caprador also has flying. Vulpikeet is a mutate creature with flying. And Wingfold Terron we've seen before. You can choose hexproof or flying with it. Glimmerbell we've also seen. Dreamtail Heron, a flyer, and one we've seen as well. Avian Oddity, another card that lets you put a flying counter on something, or it can just be played as a flyer itself. So what are the rares here? Well, there's Luminous Broodmoth, which is an insane card anyway, and it's kind of awkward because if your deck is actually loaded up with flyers, Luminous Broodmoth will not actually be able to bring them back. So in some ways it has some not complete synergy here because you won't be able to bring your creatures back as much. However, you're going to have creatures who don't have flying in this deck. You know, you're probably going to have like 7 or 8 flyers and some creatures without it. And the Broodmoth is a big flyer anyway, and it will still be bringing stuff back. But it's actually going to be a little less frequent in this deck in some ways because you have so many flyers. But at the same time, it sort of lets you play maybe a few less flyers than you normally would because it's going to be able to give flying to other things. Skycat Sovereign gets bigger. We saw this earlier. It makes flyers too. Yorion, Sky Nomad. You do have cards in this color pair with Into the Battlefield abilities, several of them, and it blinks things, and it's just a big flyer. Next up, it's Red-Green, which is all about Trample. The uncommon here makes it so that all your creatures with Trample can assign its combat damage as though they weren't blocked, which is a really powerful effect. If you have a table with like 3 Tramplers, that's going to be a nightmare, and that's not a crazy thing. Quartzwood Crasher is a great Trample payoff as well. You make a dinosaur token anytime one or more of your Trample creatures does damage to the opponent, where X is the amount of damage those creatures dealt to that player. Note, that means you're going to get 1 big token if you hit your opponent with like 3 things, not 3 smaller tokens, just 1 big token. Worth noting, though, that the token that is made also has Trample, so it's going to sort of snowball on your opponent. It's going to be hard for them to stop you from making more things. Quartzwood Crasher is a straight-up bomb. It's incredibly powerful, and I think Proud Wildbonder might be the best in this cycle. Definitely very good. Maybe not the best, but it is very good, and that's good news for Trample. So what are the Trample payoffs? Well, we have our Wildbonder. There's also Hornbash Mentor. We've seen a lot of mentors already. Gives some non-human Trample, and then can pump everything with a +1/+1 counter that has Trample. Monstrous Step isn't a card I love, but this is where it's going to be at its best, because if you give something Trample and you're giving it +7/+7, it's going to create some nightmare scenarios for your opponent, even if they do have ways to block it. Unfortunate it's not an instant, but it would probably be too good if it were. Ram Through, which is a great removal spell no matter what, but it lets you do some additional damage to your opponent if you have a Trampler fight your opponent's creature. The excess damage is done to your opponent. There's also Raking Claws. This is another card I don't love, but if there's a home for it, it's this. It becomes Temur Battle Rage in a deck with enough Tramplers in it, and I don't need to tell you how good that card was, first of all, in Limited, and how good it is in general, as it sees play in lots of formats. And it also has Cycling, which is a nice thing to have if you don't really need the Trample. Cards with Trample. We have our Proud Wildbonder, Tigerilla, which can choose a Trample counter. Pyroceratops may not be at its best here. It's probably better in blue-red, but it does have Trample. Brushwag also has Trample. Excavation Mole, mills you, has Trample. Fully Grown puts a Trample counter on your creature in addition to being a trick. Titanoth Rex also puts a Trample counter onto a creature when you cycle it. Footfall Crater can make it so you can give a creature Trample and Haste every turn, potentially. When you cycle something, the Reptilian Reflection does become a 5/4 dinosaur Trample and Haste. It will probably be more well-suited to the red-white cycling deck than it will be here, but it does say Trample on it. Rares, well, we've already seen Yidaro when we talked about cycling. We saw the Crasher earlier here, and we've already seen the Gem Razor too, but it does have Trample, so there you go. Menace is the next archetype in black-red. You have Sonorous Howlbonder, has Menace itself, and it makes all of your Menace creatures need not only 2 creatures to block them, but 3. So it's super Menace in a way, and that is a pretty good evasive ability. So I'm pretty high on the Howlbonder, just like I am on the red-green Trample guy. They both seem to give a pretty powerful boost to the keyword, and Howlbonder seems really sweet. If you have a board with like 3 Menace creatures on it, that is not easy to block for your opponent. That means they need 9 creatures to block all 3. It's going to be silly. The rare is Labyrinth Raptor, which also gives Menace an upgrade. Anytime a creature with Menace is blocked, the defending player has to sacrifice a creature, and you can also pump all your creatures with Menace. Menace Payoffs. We've got our Howlbonder. There's also Tentative Connection, which is a threaten effect that costs 3 less if you control a creature with Menace. And a threaten effect in general is better with Menace because it makes it even less likely your opponent can block if you're taking away one of their blockers. So they're already well suited to this deck, and this one in particular, costing as little as it does, can be really scary. There's also Frill Scare Mentor, which lets you give Menace to a non-human, and you can tap it and pay some mana later in the game to put +1/+1 counters on each creature you control that has Menace. So the cards with Menace. We've got our Howlbonder. We also have Cavern Whisperer, who can also mutate. Grim Dancer, which can choose a Menace counter among 2 other counters. Blood Curdle, which puts a Menace counter on a creature you control. Call of the Death Dweller, which can put a Menace counter on a creature you reanimate. Ferocious Tigerilla, which can gain Menace if that's what you choose to do. The rares here are Hunted Nightmare, a huge creature with Menace that has a bit of a downside, but if you can get around it, and it will become easier to get around if you have things like Labyrinth Raptor or Sonorous Howlbonder. If you can get around that problem, it's really good. I have Zerta here only because making a single creature unable to block is likely to be more powerful than normal in this color pair. And there's also Labyrinth Raptor, which we already saw. So those are the 10 2-color decks in this format. As I mentioned throughout, there is really good fixing, and sometimes you can go into a wedge, which is something to think about. And splashing will certainly be very easy in this format. So keep that in mind as well. You're not always going to end up in 2 colors, but you're probably going to end up in a deck that is more about one of these color pairs than it is whatever other color pairs exist within that 3-color deck. And in general, the 5 non-keyword related archetypes do seem to have more support, but there is enough support for the other 5 that those decks will come together. They may not be quite as synergistic as the others, but they will come together. So yeah, that's it. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future limited content, future set reviews, future archetype guides, don't forget to subscribe. And if you're looking for my playlist of my full set review for this set, you should see it on the screen shortly. Thanks for watching.